In the Far East, autumn comes quickly and harshly. The evening of October 2nd, 1974 in Yakutsk began as usual. A gloomy sky, damp air, and a dark strip of the airfield, illuminated by even rows of lights. Here, in the silence of a cold evening, an An-12 heavy transport aircraft was preparing to take off. His task was to transport 12 tons of fresh vegetables to Magadan, a cargo that at first glance was quite mundane, as familiar as the flight itself. Against the background of the booming wind and the steady hum of auxiliary systems, the car seemed calm and confident. The four propellers of the AI-20 turboprop engines were ready to lift the multi-ton aircraft into the night sky. There was a sense of routine in the cockpit, where the instruments glowed with a soft green light. The commander and co-pilot checked the control charts, flight mechanics monitored the pressure in the hydraulic system, radio operators checked the communication channels. Everything seemed to be going according to a well-established pattern. But you only have to look to the side, beyond the illuminated strip, to feel the difference. Where the headlights and spotlights ended, the real Far Eastern night began. Thick darkness, hiding the hills stretching to the sea, endless forests and clouds that seemed to be pressed to the ground. And it was into this darkness that the crew had to leave. The contrast was striking. Everything was under control on Earth. There was confidence and the usual order. But Magadan was waiting ahead, an airfield surrounded by mountains and covered with rain clouds, where a simple approach scheme on paper could turn into a daunting task. Every wrong degree of the course could be fatal there. It was a moment when technology and man were still in balance. The An-12, a machine designed to operate in any environment, was preparing for departure. The crew consists of experienced specialists who have flown hundreds of flights. Everything looked secure and calm, but the night over Kolyma was already preparing its trials. And in this darkness, the lights could not be a salvation, but a trap. That October evening, it all started as if it was just another routine flight. The An-12, squat and powerful, stood at the platform of the Yakutsk airport. Its cargo hold was filled with 12 tons of vegetables, neatly stacked in crates. For a region where the climate is harsh and food supplies have always been difficult, such a flight was much more important than a simple delivery. This flight was part of a large supply chain on which the lives of people on the coast of the Sea of Yakutsk depended. There were 10 people on board. The cabin contains the full crew of the 139th Flight Squadron. A commander, a co-pilot, a navigator, 2 mechanics, radio operators, and a flight attendant. They were joined by 2 cargo escorts. On such flights, the crew was not just a team. Everyone knew their part of the job, and only joint actions ensured reliability. Before departure, the commander carefully studied the control charts. But this attentiveness was rather formal. He had not flown to Magadan for 4 years. During this time, a lot has changed. The schemes are being updated, the equipment is changing, and most importantly, the minor features of the airfield are being erased from memory. Where earlier confidence was based on habit, now there was only trust in the devices. The An-12 was ready. His cabin is an entire command post. Aircraft horizons, speed indicators, altimeters, and radio compasses shone in front of the commander and co-pilot. On the right, the navigator monitored the route and the setting of the drive beacons. From behind, as if behind the scenes, flight mechanics controlled the fuel tanks, oil pressure, and turbine temperature. Everyone has their own area of work, their own area of responsibility. Everything looked as reliable as a clock. At 7:06 p.m. local time, the dispatcher gave permission for departure. The engines gave out a steady, confident roar. The wheels of the heavy machine lifted off the concrete strip, and the An-12 easily gained altitude. This moment has always been special for the crew. It's only a few seconds from the calm earth to the night sky, and in those seconds, the confidence was felt especially keenly. The plane entered the route, took up an altitude of 7,800 meters, and the flight went according to plan. At altitude, the night looked different. Endless darkness stretched under the wing, and ahead was a cloud wall hiding the coast of Kolyma. From above, it seemed that this flight would be calm. Smooth instruments, predictable course, familiar cargo. But the closer they got to Magadan, the clearer it became. the trials had just begun. Everything looked as clear as possible on the maps of the approach to Magadan. The algorithm is prescribed step by step. First, a descent to 2,400 meters, access to the long-range drive beacon, then a descent to the height of the circle and landing at a course of 104 degrees. The scheme is familiar to every pilot who has flown to this airport. There were no difficulties here because the drive beacons provided accurate landmarks and the magnetic course eliminated confusion. But paper is one thing and reality is quite another. The sky over Magadan that evening was covered with clouds, the lower limit of which was kept at around 1,000 meters. It was raining incessantly from the clouds. The combination of low visibility and dark night turned the ideal scheme into a test of attentiveness and coherence. You couldn't rely on the eye here, just the instruments. The An-12 began its descent. There was still calmness at the height. The course instruments showed the correct direction, the engine was running smoothly, overloads were normal. But the lower the plane descended, the more difficult the task became. The pilots performed standard pre-landing turns. First the second, then the third, then the fourth. The roll was kept within 20 degrees, and the vertical descent rate reached 10 meters per second. All this met the standards, but there was already tension in the cockpit. Mistakes in such a sequence of maneuvers were not forgiven. After the fourth turn, the An-12 found itself 2.5 kilometers to the left of the landing axis. For a large transport company, this was already a significant deviation. The dispatcher informed the crew about this, but instead of a confident correction, the situation became more and more difficult. The plane had crossed the course line at an altitude of only 730 meters, and now everything depended on the accuracy of the crew's work. The contrast was stunning. In the diagram, the entry looked simple, like descending a staircase, where every step is known in advance. But in reality, everything turned into a game with mistakes. Any inaccurate steering movement, incorrect roll, or extra seconds of delay changed the picture. And the more the An-12 approached Magadan, the clearer it became. In this darkness and rain, the scheme was not a salvation, but a test of ultimate strength. It would seem that the An-12 was still within the acceptable range. The roll did not exceed 20 degrees, the descent was controlled, and even the deviation from the axis could be corrected. But it is precisely at such moments that invisible cracks are born, not in technology but in human coherence. There was silence in the cabin, which was not a sign of confidence, but, on the contrary, an alarming signal. The navigator, whose task is to navigate and check the course with the drive beacons, behaved aloof. His silence deprived the commander of his main support. The co-pilot also did not interfere, did not suggest adjustments. It turned out that the multi-seat cabin, designed for teamwork, actually turned into a space where the commander was left alone with the instruments and his decisions. It was then that the first stage of the flaps was released. 25 degrees is the standard mode for switching to the pre-landing configuration. The plane began to get heavier, the behavior of the machine changed, the wing gave more lift, but the resistance also increased. In such conditions, precision was required. But instead of consistency, everything looked strained. The commander tried to stay on course, but his head was becoming increasingly confused with instrument readings and visual landmarks. He remembered that Magadan greeted the pilot with 2 rows of strip lights, and he was already beginning to peer into the night. But this was the very line beyond which it was dangerous to cross. The instruments showed one thing, the eyes hinted at another. The tension was also increased because the speed remained high. The plane had crossed the course line at the maximum permissible parameters, and now any wrong movement threatened to lead to an even greater deviation. But no one in the cockpit objected, said, "Slow down, take a break." Instead, there was silence in the air. So step by step the mistakes accumulated. And if from the outside, in the night over Magadan, it seemed that the plane was calmly going to land, then inside the hidden mechanism of the future catastrophe was already beginning to work. When the plane emerged from a dense layer of clouds, lights appeared ahead. It was a long-awaited landmark for the commander. In his memory, Magadan was associated with them, a strip of steady airfield lights piercing the darkness. I felt a sense of relief inside. Finally, I could walk not only by the instruments, but also in the place. But it was a deceptive relief. Those lights didn't belong to the runway at all. Ahead was the village of Splavnaya, a small settlement that lay off course. Its streets were illuminated by yellow electric lights, and on a dark, rainy night they might well have looked like airfield lights. The contrast was stunning. The instruments stubbornly pointed to one thing, while the commander's eyes insisted on the other. And the man chose something that seemed closer and clearer. He switched from instrument mode to visual flight, confident that he was on the right course. The most disturbing thing was that no one in the cockpit objected. The navigator did not check the data of the radio compass. The co-pilot did not doubt the commander's decision. It was as if everyone had succumbed to a common illusion. The visual reference seemed more reliable than the lines on the dashboard. It was this moment that became a turning point, where it was necessary to hold tightly to the instruments and trust only accurate data. The commander chose lights in the dark, and what was supposed to be a rescue turned into a trap. Now the An-12 was heading not towards the airfield, but towards the mountains, and every kilometer only increased the gap with the real landing course. A lingering uncertainty grew in the cabin. The commander was sure that he was flying the plane directly to the runway. But suddenly the dispatcher's voice was heard on the air. "You are half a kilometer to the right of the landing course axis." The words sounded like a cold shower. Everything that the commander saw with his own eyes was crumbling. If these are not airfield lights, then where are they at all? That second of confusion was the key. In conditions of night and rain, the loss of spatial orientation is especially acute. The instruments say one thing, the vision is different, and the pilot's brain can no longer put together the overall picture. The best solution in such a situation is to go for a second lap, gain altitude, and try again. And that's exactly what the commander did. He informed the dispatcher of his decision, and in response received the standard instruction: go to the second round. Everything looked right, but the devil was in the details. To begin climbing, the crew retracted the landing gear and flaps almost simultaneously. For the An-12, such manipulation was too abrupt. With the disappearance of lift, the car immediately sank down. The AI-20 turboprop engines were powerful, but their inertia did not allow them to instantly compensate for the loss. The variometer slid down sharply. The vertical speed reached 8 meters per second. For an aircraft that was only 700 meters high, it was critically dangerous. The contrast was dramatic. The decision to retire was supposed to be a rescue, but in reality it was a step towards disaster. The cabin was filled with tense commands, but there was no time left. The dark slopes, hidden by rain and clouds, were rapidly approaching. Just half a minute after the report of the re-entry, the An-12 crashed into the slope of a hill 13 kilometers from the airport at an altitude of about 500 meters. That night, darkness engulfed the plane and everyone on board. When the commander moved the plane away, the crew still had a chance. In aviation, such maneuvers are considered standard. If the approach is unsuccessful, if the course is shot down, if there is the slightest doubt, the pilot is obliged to go on a second lap. This is a normal procedure, and it has saved lives many times. But this time everything went differently. The flaps and landing gear began to retract almost simultaneously. This is a serious burden for any large transport operator. At that moment, the An-12 seemed to have lost some of its support. The lifting force dropped sharply, and the inertia of the heavy machine pushed it down. The cabin felt a dip, a slight push down, as if an invisible hand had sharply pulled the plane. The variometer showed -8 meters per second, and this despite the fact that there were only a few hundred meters left to the ground. The commander pulled the steering wheel towards himself, trying to compensate for the fall. The co-pilot duplicated the commands aloud, but there was confusion in his voice. The flight mechanic reported on the engine parameters. The speed increased, but the turbines could not immediately reach full power. Turboprop AI-20s always took time to accelerate, and those seconds became the most expensive in the crew's life. It was completely dark outside. Low clouds and rain hid the terrain, and there was no runway or airfield lights ahead, just a black wall of night. For the commander, it was a blind struggle. The instruments showed a decrease, and the feeling of the body, overload and noise in the cabin gave contradictory signals. The radio operator tried to keep in touch with the dispatcher, but the broadcast was drowned out by abrupt commands and tense reports. The navigator still did not interfere. His silence became a symbol of the whole situation. At that moment, a man was needed who was ready to say, "We are holding the instruments. The course is wrong. Turn." But no one dared to interrupt the commander. Chaos was growing in the cabin. Everyone was doing their part, but the big picture was gone. The seconds dragged by excruciatingly long. The decline continued, and the variometer stubbornly showed a drawdown. 500 meters, 480, 450. The ground was already nearby. No one saw her, but everyone knew she was close. This is one of the scariest conditions for pilots. You know there's an obstacle ahead, but you can't see it. All the senses go against logic, and all that remains is to cling to the devices. But there was no time for that. At 2,335 hours, the An-12 collided with a mountain slope. To an outside observer, it was just a short burst of light in the night, a bright flash from impact and flying debris. For the crew, these were the last moments of the struggle, which ended in an instant. The Magadan greeted the morning with the same rain. The hills, hidden in the clouds, remained silent about the events of the previous night. People in the city were waking up, rushing about their business, and only a few knew that nearby on the mountainside lay the wreckage of a heavy transport ship, whose name is now forever inscribed in history. The commission compiled a dry report: crew errors, lack of interaction, incorrect actions when leaving for the second round, passivity of dispatchers. The cold lines of the protocols decomposed the tragedy into facts and figures. But there were people behind each figure, 10 crew members and escorts who believed they were making a regular flight. There is always a contrast in aviation. On the one hand, there are techniques, diagrams, and instructions. On the other hand, there is the human factor, emotions, fatigue, experience, or lack thereof. This time, the car was working properly, the fuel was normal, the appliances were working. Everything that could break remained intact. But the invisible part broke down: consistency, discipline, attentiveness. The lights that the commander mistook for salvation became a mirage. The decision to go to the second round, conceived as a way out, turned into a path to disaster. And the silence of those who could have intervened became the silence that engulfed the plane along with the crew. This story has become a reminder to everyone who takes to the skies. There are no small things. There is no right to formality. Instruments are always more accurate than eyes. Discipline is more important than self. Confidence and the interaction of the crew is the very thread that keeps the plane in the air even when it's night, rain, and mountains around. The Magadan Hills preserve the memory of this flight, and everyone who flies over them today knows that the lessons of the past were written at too high a price in these mountains.